You hear those funky beats, those laid back, chill vibes. You know what time it is. It's time for another episode of Jacobin Talks. Thanks for tuning in. I am Jacobin Deputy Editor Micah Utricht. And as most of you probably know, we do these talks several times a week. We've been doing them since the onset of the pandemic. And we pick a topic, bring somebody usually who has written on the topic, an activist, an organizer, a writer, academic, and we give a little talk about it, or we have a conversation about it, and we also bring in you, the viewers. And so if you're watching this on Facebook or on YouTube Live right now, please do chime in the comments section for your questions for today's talk. Before we get into today's talk, tomorrow we have another edition of our show Weekends, hosted by Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila, and they will be joined by the Marxist academic Richard Wolff. I shouldn't call him a Marxist academic. I should say something sexier than that. The preeminent Marxist thinker and activist Richard Wolff. Yeah, he's nothing as boring as an academic. So tune in tomorrow 1 p.m. for our next episode of Weekends. And we are lucky enough today to be joined by Leigh Phillips, who is a regular contributor to Jacobin on a number of issues, especially on issues around science. He's also the author or co-author of two books, Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse Porn Addicts, and People's Republic of Walmart, which he co-wrote with Michal Rozworski. Leigh, totally independently of me knowing that I was going to be doing this talk with you, I picked your book up last night and I started it, but unfortunately I only got to the opening acknowledgments. So all I know is that the origins of the book are of Leigh and his co-author Michal getting drunk in a bar. Can you hear me okay there, Leigh?
Yeah, my laptop died today, and I'm doing this on my phone, and my mom just called. So.
Well, hello to Mom. And I was just saying that I started your book, but all I've read is the acknowledgments. So I don't know much about what's in your book yet. But if folks want to find out for themselves, versobooks.com and search for the People's Republic of Walmart. But today we are going to be talking about your recent work on vaccinations. You've got a recent piece in Jacobin called Tough on Anti-Vaxx Nonsense, Tough on the Causes of Anti-Vaxx Nonsense. And rather than doing a full-on lecture, we're going to do a conversation about this. So again, folks who are watching, please chime in with your questions, with your comments. I'll do my best to read as many of them as possible. And of course, as always, please do like the video. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please share it on your social media feeds. Please spread the word about these talks that we're doing. So, Leigh, why don't you just begin with your overall argument in the piece? I mean, you know, you're saying that you're sort of tough on anti-vax nonsense as well as tough on its causes. So, what is the overall argument? What are the sort of the two prongs that you're making an argument for in the piece?
Well, I guess just to begin with, I think there is a few interesting events that happened in the last few weeks. One was that during the debate, the vice presidential debate between Harris and Pence, Kamala Harris made a very, very worrying sort of series of comments around vaccination, in that she basically said, if Anthony Fauci says it's okay to take a COVID vaccine, she'll take it, but she won't take a Trump vaccine, or something along those lines. And as I was watching it, I was, no, don't put it there. It sort of offers, it's a gift to anti-vaccination activists. I think there is absolutely rationale to be very concerned about, and let me make sure I'm saying this very carefully myself. It is true that Donald Trump has been meddling with the process, the Operation Warp Speed, which public officials do support strongly, which was basically trying to do this as fast as possible, record time, and also have the government fund the clinical trials, which are very expensive, and then also to be manufacturing different options for the vaccines simultaneously, rather than wait until safety and efficacy trials would be completed, so that once one was ready to go, or a couple of them, we could just suddenly just pump out tons of vaccines. All that part of that's good. The problem was that Donald Trump has been sort of leaning on the CEOs of pharmaceutical companies involved with this Operation Warp Speed effort to really to speed this up, and also to sort of do we really need to go through the safety and efficacy trials? So there's real reason to be concerned about that. But the way that I would have preferred Kamala Harris to put it would be, please stop interfering in this process so that there is an undermining of faith in vaccines. Instead, she basically said to anybody who is a sort of anti-vaccine activist, or even just has hesitancy around vaccines, said, if you don't trust Big Pharma, it's okay for you to not take a vaccine as well. And that was a really, really, really bad messaging, unfortunately. And then this happened just a couple of weeks after a major paper in the Lancet, the medical journal, the British Medical Journal, put out by a series of researchers, epidemiologists, clinicians, and anthropologists, and some political scientists who, with the Vaccine Confidence Project, which has been tracking confidence in vaccines around the world since 2015. And it is the very first major global study of comprehensive study of this. There's data here and there, but there's never been one sort of comprehensively. And crucially, there are two key dates. So there's 2015 and then there's 2019. There you can see the that is a map at the moment from 2015 showing levels of confidence. Basically, the blue, light blue, dark blue colors are places where there's a very high confidence in the confidence in vaccines, and then orange, red, and yellow are the ones with not much confidence. And we'll get back to that in a second. In terms of just note there that it's pretty much the global north that has, that looks like a bowl of citrus fruit there, and it's the global south that is, nice and blue, like a Smurf wearing denim. And then the second period is 2019. So crucially here, there's a time series. There's a nice trajectory there to see how things have developed in the last few years. And then, of course, at the same time as this, in August, a few weeks before that, Vladimir Putin in Russia has been engaged in a similar sort of meddling with the process, and Russia looks to be the very first country to have a health authority that approves a COVID vaccine. And epidemiologists and vaccine specialists in Russia are pulling their hair out, saying this is, you've done this, you've approved this before the safety and efficacy trials have been completed. The great danger in both of these cases is not so much danger, sort of harm from the vaccine. It is more the loss of faith in vaccines. Already this year, we've seen a staggering drop in the number of families who have their children vaccinated for a range of different other potential infectious diseases. And we have data from the UK, from Germany, from the United States saying that a sort of faith in vaccination, or whether they would take a COVID vaccine, has dropped. From March, it was around the high 70s down to under 50%. So this is an enormous problem, and I wanted to write about the issues around that, because a lot of the very correct discourse from public health officials, from science advocacy organizations, has tended to focus on trying to educate people about, how we should be trusting in vaccines, and vaccines save 2 to 3 million people's lives a year. And all of that is great, absolutely great. That's the sort of the tough on anti-vax nonsense side of the story, that the first part of the title of my article. And the second part that I wanted to talk about as well was, we also have to be tough on the causes of anti-vax nonsense. And the sort of latter half of the article, I talk about the reasons that there has been this decline over the last 30 years or so in the global north.
Yeah, so why don't you talk a little bit more about that and those reasons for decline? I mean, that map was kind of horrifying to see,
Yeah.
the low levels of confidence in vaccination. I should say that even in the comments section, as we are speaking right now, there are totally unhinged people spreading anti-vaxxer nonsense. So it's clearly pretty widespread, at least among the global north. So also, just looking at that now, I mean, what's up with these, even lower than in the United States, is throughout Europe? I mean, really low numbers of trust.
France is terrible. France is particularly bad. You will see in those two, the difference between those two maps. The first one is pretty egregious, and the second one isn't quite as bad. You can see that there's been a bit of an uptick in Canada and some parts of Western Europe there, in terms of confidence. So France went up, if I'm remembering my data right, went up from a 9% confidence, that is to say, just 9% of people in France in 2015 believed vaccines were safe. That's gone up to 30%, which is still really, really, really low. There's not a single developed country so the list of all the different countries around the world and their levels of confidence, there's not a single developed country in the top 10, not in the top 20, not even in the top 30. The developed country with the highest confidence in vaccination is Australia, and it's only the 33rd highest levels of confidence, and it's still not great. Whereas the countries with the highest levels of confidence, the very highest, the top 3, are Uganda, Liberia, and Bangladesh, all in the high 80s in terms of confidence in the safety of vaccines. There's many sort of interlocking reasons for this. There's no one sort of simple thing, but what a lot of public health officials will say is that, and this is absolutely true, I think, is that we've had vaccines for about 100 years. And we also have antibiotics and surgery and modern sewage systems and hygiene. All of these things together have basically resulted in, until relatively recently, not an eradication of infectious disease, but a radical drop compared to the rest of human history. And so outside of people who were affected by the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the 80s and 90s, most people in the West are unused to the reality of being surrounded by the potential of death and morbidity from infectious disease. This is changing in recent years with the rise of antibiotic resistance, but generally it's largely because we don't know. Whereas in the developing world, that sort of eradication of infectious disease, or not eradication, but a radical drop in infectious disease rates, never really happened. And so they're confronted on a daily basis with the raft of diseases that we historically were, but also, a lot of sort of tropical infectious diseases that our pharmaceutical companies have decided we're just not interested in doing any sort of development of research and development into vaccines for those. So that's one that's the sort of the primary reason why there's that split between the global north and the global south. The global north, we've forgotten how wonderful vaccines are. We've forgotten the wonder that they represent. Secondly, over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a radical drop in trust in public officials, in experts, in elected representatives. And a lot of reasons for this wrapped up, and a lot of the same reasons that we see the rise of populism, but also in the rise of the new left, or the new left. That as inequality has soared around the world, particularly within countries in the developed world, and we've seen episode after episode after episode of the experts being wrong, from the war in Iraq to the 2008 economic crisis, and over and over again, the Eurozone crisis. There has been a raft of moves on the part of elites to move a lot of policy areas out of the realm of democratic decision making, and leave it to the experts to deal with. Well, in that sort of circumstances, it's no wonder that the vast majority of working people, people in general, begin to lose faith in the experts. And one of the reasons that I make the argument that we need to not just be tough on anti-vaccine nonsense, but also tough on the causes, is that some of the sort of science communications figures, public health officials who are doing the Lord's work in terms of promoting understanding of the safety of vaccines, are also at the same time some of them have a sort of attitude that, well, people are, some people are too stupid, and this should not be up for democratic debate. This should be left for the experts, the scientific experts. People are too stupid. And I mean, one, that's just counterproductive. But two, one of the examples I use here is actually from an article by our colleague David Broder, who is the Europe editor of Jacobin, and wrote an excellent article a few months ago about the rise of anti-vaccine sentiment in Italy, particularly promoted by the hard right Lega party, and by the Five-Star Movement, which is a very strange, you can sort of fit it on the left or the right, sort of melange of anti-immigrant sentiment and localism and anti-Eurozone. It's all sort of a mishmash there. And they're also strongly anti-vaccine. And he talks about a fairly famous scientist figure in Italy, who has become very well known as a result of defending vaccines, and that's great that he's doing that. But he also, in a lot of the language that he's using, he basically is one of these figures who's saying, no, people are too stupid. This is, science is not a democracy. Leave this to the clever people. And, this really, really reminded me of when I was in Brussels as a reporter there, and I lost count of how many officials with the European Commission would say things along the lines of, we need to take fiscal policy out of the hands of democratic decision making because the people are too stupid. If we continue to allow them to have democratic decision making over fiscal policy, they'll just vote themselves into greater and greater debt. We need to leave this for the experts. So ironically, this sort of technocratic policy making, removing whatever topic happens to be, in this case, vaccination, out of the realm of democratic debate, ironically, technocracy is undermining faith in experts. Experts should be their advisors to democracy. They do not replace democracy.
Right. So I think that people who are on the left hopefully understand this point already about many key political issues, the shortcomings of technocracy, the sort of like almost like a fundamentalist version of technocracy, right? Is just like leave the fine arts of governing to the real experts. And the art of governing is for the most part not political, and leave it to the people with master's degrees and PhDs or whatever. So liberals certainly don't understand the shortcomings of that approach. That's still very dominant among American liberalism and liberalism elsewhere. But people haven't quite picked up this argument when it comes to science and when it comes to these issues of things like vaccines. I think understandably, because people are so horrified of the what you rightly call the anti-vax nonsense. But I guess the question is for you. I would ask you to just go a little bit sort of deeper, reflecting on this, like how. I mean, there is a kind of way that science does have to be. I mean, you do have to sort of turn some of it over to the experts, right? I mean, like that's the job of the scientist, is to like accumulate knowledge. This is sort of like part of like basic Enlightenment values, right? Is like the scientists will accumulate the knowledge and the wisdom and the expertise, and then they will handle stuff that Lord knows I am not qualified to handle. So how do we sort of balance that, and then how do people who don't want to fall into that trap of this sort of like beating people over the head with this sort of like you mere peon have nothing to say about this issue and just let the big boys handle it. How do you sort of deal with those two things at the same time?
Well, for a Democrat, it should be fairly straightforward. By Democrat, I mean a small d Democrat. In that, I mean, an engineer can advise democratically elected representatives how to build a bridge. Those democratically elected representatives don't have to have any expertise in bridge building. But an engineer can't decide to build a bridge. That has to be a decision left up to us. And that's the crucial distinction. And I think a number of sort of centrist, sort of liberals have fallen in love with the idea of technocracy, of just leaving it to the experts. But there is no expert. There's no set of experts in what the correct policy is for anything. There's only, given a certain policy that we have democratically decided we're going to do, what's the best way to do that? Okay, experts tell us, help us out here. That's the crucial split. And there's been this muddying of the waters for a lot of sort of self-interested reasons. The reason why there was this call to Larry Summers-esque expertise with respect to financial markets and public debt and so on and so forth was precisely to undermine democracy in the interest of elites. It wasn't that those sets of economists happened to objectively know what the correct set of policies were, as we saw, obviously, with the 2008 crisis.
Right, but that makes sense when it comes to bridge building. But I guess I'm wondering how the rubber will hit the road when it comes to vaccination issues, because there is, I mean, one could say, well, okay, if we're going to do this democratically, if we are these small d Democrats that we say we are going to actually make this a sort of democratic process, and we're going to have people who are here to offer us the vaccines, but the decision of the administration of the vaccines will be a democratically decided process. Well, that's very different than the building of a bridge or whatever. And we really do need everybody to take the vaccinations, right? So I guess I'm still just sort of struggling a little bit with how we actually get people to take these vaccines when, like, we do need to require everybody to take them all, right?
But I mean, the majority of people in most places, most jurisdictions have democratically decided, yes, okay, fair enough, we recognize that bourgeois democracy isn't fully democratic, but nevertheless, on a question like this, it's pretty straightforward that the majority of people have decided in most jurisdictions that we accept the validity, the safety and efficacy vaccines and how important they are. Not primarily not because it saves you, the individual, but because it saves everybody else through herd immunity. It's a similar thing to the issue with masks today with respect to COVID. Masks aren't really about saving you; it's about saving other people. It's your responsibility, your duty as a citizen to your fellow citizens. A similar sort of thing. So we've already democratically decided that. So that's fine. I suppose where you might want to be going with this is, how do we deal with people who don't want to? And as a Democrat, I say, well, tough titty. The majority has decided that we all will take take these vaccines. It's your responsibility to do that. And there have been in many jurisdictions for a long time so-called religious or philosophical exemptions. Increasingly, jurisdictions are eliminating those. I totally support those eliminations. I would hesitate around making them mandatory, because over issues around sort of bodily autonomy, and that might accidentally end up being counterproductive. So I really be hesitant before we move towards things like mandatory vaccination. But if a majority of people decide that that's what we need to do in the current circumstance, then the majority rules.
So you write in the
that's a separate issue to technocracy and the undermining of expertise.
Right. So you write in the piece about how we already are in the middle of this culture war. I mean, in America, at least, like, so much of our politics is now just become culture war issues, and mask wearing has become another culture war issue. And clearly the issue of vaccination is such an issue. It was an issue already before Kamala Harris stated what she stated, but her statement sort of risks not just becoming a kind of like currently we're used to the right waging these culture war issues against masks and things, but now it's like inserting another way, like making this now on the left or among liberals that this could be another type of culture war issue. I guess the question, and if you have a good answer to this, I think you should probably stop writing for Jacobin and go like make money somewhere else, because this is really the $64,000 question. But how we get in with operating in a democratic context, as you were just explaining, not shoving this down people's throats or into their arms in a technocratic way, but how do we get out of this morass of this the culture war when it comes to these kinds of public health issues?
Okay, so a couple of things there. The first, I would say, yeah, I'm very concerned that what I really hope doesn't happen is a sort of reversal of the culture war that we've just seen over the last few months around masks, where Democrats wear masks and Republicans don't. And it's now, if it flips over to, especially if Trump is elected in a few days' time, Republicans get their jab, and Democrats don't get vaccinated. That would be the worst situation. I would love to see some sort of statement from her, sort of clarifying that on her own side. I think that's very important. On the broader question of how do we overcome this, and I talk about this at length in the bottom half of the second sort of half of the article. There's multiple interlocking issues here. One is, and again, sort of public health officials will flag this, the sort of online media, the incentive structures within the likes of Facebook and Twitter, although Twitter is much more sort of minority, smaller concern, that there's 2 billion people on Facebook, so that's much clearer of an issue. The incentives there to maximize the sort of screen time, your attention to the amount of time that you're spending on Facebook, and the use of behavioral science to within those organizations, those companies, to recognize that rage and fear are the greatest drivers of greater attention to these websites, and rational, scientific, sober explanation of the issues does basically brings in a lot less money in terms of advertising to the Facebooks of the world. So that is a huge issue. I remember you and I think Megan Day talked quite a bit about that issue on your podcast with respect to the Social Dilemma movie. And I think, Micah, your comments there were just absolutely excellent. It's fundamentally a product of the market. So you're in the short term, we can't expect, we've got to be realistic here. We can't expect a nationalization or decommodification of Facebook tomorrow. And even if we did, given the US state the way that it is that really what we would want in terms of all our personal information being accessible by, say, the CIA or NSA? So we have to think.
Not to mention thinking of Donald Trump as the CEO of Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to think through really hard about how we're going to go about doing that. That's true for many other issues, not just with vaccination. And that's a really hard one. I do know I want to see them decommodified, but how we do that, I don't quite know yet. What I do know, and again, this was something that you brought up, Micah, was that antitrust breakup of Facebook, because that's not going to solve anything, because instead of one Facebook, now you're going to have 12 Facebooks with the same market incentive to do exactly the same thing. So that's not an answer either. The second thing that we have to keep in mind here is that it's not just an issue with social media, with online stuff, but also with the legacy media. Newspapers and magazines have their advertising dollars have been gutted as a result of the internet over the last 25 years. And they're increasingly driven by clickbait, by headlines, no less than the sort of a model within social media, even if not quite as behavioral science driven or as devious. And that's, the newsrooms have been gutted. There are very few science journalists within with a lot of newspapers just have stopped having science journalists, as well as not having court reporters in rural areas, labor reporters. All of that has been sort of gutted, and a lot of the journalists who cover scientific issues don't have any scientific training. There's going to a newspaper is going to have many more hits, therefore attract more advertising from some celebrity gossip than they will from a very sober, careful explanation of why vaccines are safe, why they're effective, how many lives they save, how herd immunity works, and so on. So we have to solve that issue as well, and that's another huge issue. As a trade unionist within the journalism field, I worked with a lot of people a number of years ago in the National Union of Journalists in the UK and in Europe to try to develop possible models for placing a levy or some sort of tax on the Googles of the world and the telecommunications companies, which are some of the most profitable companies in the world, and then redirecting that money to households to use as they would like, as a sort of credit that they could spend on journalism, so long as XYZ magazine or publication had a minimum of, say, 15 pages of hard news or whatever. It's fairly straight. It could be fairly straightforwardly administered without there being the problem of the government saying, "I'm now just going to throw billions at NPR or PBS." As much as I love NPR and PBS, but this would allow new sort of publications to emerge and to allow across the board a revival of hard news, in particular scientific reporting. So those are two issues, and then finally, there's a number of other ones as well, but finally, I do think that we on the left have to, particularly within academia, have to issue something of a mea culpa here. as a result of sort of post-structuralist analysis particularly within the humanities, there's been a sort of undermining of the idea of truth, of science, discussion of science as somehow Eurocentric and colonial. And we really need to separate that out from questions around class and markets, the relations of production. And insofar as people will come up with all sorts of examples of how this, that, or the other scientists have done a bad thing. Big Pharma is a classic example of this, and I talk quite extensively about the problems with Big Pharma in the piece. But then that's not the problem with science. That's the problem of classes and markets undermining the scientificity of what the researchers are doing. So, if anything, they're not being scientific enough, rather than being science being a sort of a servant of oppression and exploitation. And that set of ideas is sort of escaped the academy. It's really common to hear that sort of discussion, not just amongst activists, but more broadly in society. Famously, during the Iraq War, Dick Cheney began talking about how we'll make our own reality. This idea that there are other ways of knowing has absolutely been exploited by the right as well. It's everywhere. And what I would really like to see on the left is a revival of the conception of ourselves in the late 19th century, most well articulated by Friedrich Engels, of making distinction between scientific socialism and utopian socialism. That is to say, not to say that socialism is a science, which is sometimes conservatives think that's what we're trying to say here. The idea is that we're trying to be as scientific as possible, that in the face of new evidence and logical reason, we will change our mind. And that is applying a scientific mentality, methodology to everything that we do. And I think we should also quite fundamentally, just very upfront, just as in our communities, if ever we see any sexism or racism or anti-trade union sentiment, we'll stand up and say that's not acceptable, and explain carefully, calmly, why those ideas are wrong. And I think we should be standing up very robustly, firmly, but also carefully, calmly, empathetically, explaining the importance of vaccination, the safety of vaccines, and defending science in general. We do it with respect to climate change. We should be doing it with respect to medicine as well.
You mentioned that quote from Dick Cheney, we create our own reality. I never really thought of Dick Cheney, our most prominent post-structuralist. So you just said a bunch of stuff there that is worth talking about. I mean, one, this is like a hobby horse of yours and something that we publish a lot about in Jacobin. Yeah. This problem of distinguishing, some of the things that are wrong with Big Pharma, as well as like Big Ag and all kinds of other science-based institutions that produce stuff that we need, but under capitalism they are operating under the profit motive rather than under for the public good. So can you just briefly go through that for people who haven't read your many articles that are on this topic? I mean, it's the separating out of those two things. Why, like, a critique of Big Pharma in this case should be made. What are the differences between making a critique on a class basis versus like, well, we understand that Big Pharma is operating under the profit motive, therefore, like, we don't trust anything that they do.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head there. This is this distinction between a socialist, materialist critique of how class society and the profit motive undermine science, whether we're talking about pharmaceutical research and development, or agriculture, or the internet, social media. Making a distinction between that sort of materialist analysis and a more conspiratorial analysis, which views the problem with Big Pharma coming from their size, that they're big, that they're corporations, and that my local little alternative medicine acupuncture deliverer is somehow free of those problems. The reality is that alternative medicine is also driven by the profit motive. In many cases, the very companies that are the very large pharmaceutical companies are the same companies who produce a lot of the alternative medicine, and it kind of makes sense from their perspective, because if they don't care about this is one of the things I was going to say about with respect to Big Pharma, or one of the things I read about in the article, is how they undermine clinical trials by not publishing a raft of trials to just show nothing, that there's a sort of null result. And they will pay they'll pay for doctors or clinicians to they'll ghostwrite articles, making it seem as though their products are successful or effective. They'll ghostwrite them for these clinicians and these researchers. It's really quite devious what they're up to. Anyway, so basically, if Big Pharma doesn't really care about truth with respect to and safety and efficacy with respect to the sort of quote unquote conventional drugs that they're producing, why would they care about the fact that there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that acupuncture works, or chiropractic works, or homeopathy, or traditional Chinese medicine? They simply, the profit motive is all that matters. So they'll have divisions that produce the snake oil as well. What's I think a good way to package all of this together is sort of one of my heroes put it very well. Ben Goldacre. He's a doctor, and he's also a science communications specialist. He became fairly well known initially for battling alternative medicine and quackery, particularly in the UK, and popularizing ideas about the safety of vaccines and this sort of thing. He's also one of the strongest fighters in the UK against the everything that I was just talking about with respect to the sort of villainy of Big Pharma. He's a big campaigner for what's called all trials, which is a movement to get pharmaceutical companies and scientific publishers to simply publish all trials, regardless of whether they have a sexy result or just like nothing. Once again, there's some real issues there with the market. That's an enormous task of publishing, all the editing that goes into that, and typesetting and so on.
We lost Leigh. Maybe Leigh's mom is calling again. Oh, she really wants to talk to you, Leigh.
Anyway, what I was going to say was they have a profit motive as well. So one of the things that we need to be doing is bringing scientific publishing into the public sector. Anyway, Ben Goldacre, who's been campaigning around these issues, both against alternative medicine, quackery, and against the villainy of Big Pharma. One of his most famous lines is, "Just because Big Pharma is shit doesn't mean that magic beans cures cancer." I think that's the thing that we should have in our head. And you lost the video of me here.
We lost the video. You may need to leave and come back, but I'll keep the conversation going here until you come back. As someone whose mom calls him a lot, I sympathize with the issue here. And who wants to talk to me when you can be talking to your mom? I mean, part of what we're getting at in this conversation about the sort of like distinguishing between the critique of Big Pharma, knowing that Big Pharma operates under the profit motive. We know that the profit motive is not a great way to organize a society. In fact, if that is the principal motive that governs the decisions that are made under the society, you get all the bad stuff that we know capitalism produces. And so we all know that's true. We all know that distorts what what a big pharma ends up doing, how they produce vaccines and medicines, and how they allocate, how the privatized health companies in general allocate healthcare. But that doesn't mean that what they are producing is useless to us, or is nonsense. I mean, like, this is an argument that goes all the way back to Marx, right? That that capitalism can create incredible riches, and can creates enormous goods that we need in order to live our lives, and that the socialist project is not to reject everything that capitalists have produced and say, like, oh, that's the bad stuff. Like, capitalists made that stuff. Capitalists produced the vaccine, so we're not going to use the vaccine. Capitalists produced industrial agriculture, and so we're going to reject industrial agriculture and go back to small scale farming. I mean, it's good that we can produce agriculture on a gigantic scale to feed millions and billions of people. It's good that even though we know the shortcomings of pharmaceutical companies under capitalism, it's good that they have produced things sometimes that we can use to get millions and billions of people healthy. We have arguments about why it would be better to produce such things in under public auspices, right, and not just be enriching a small handful of capitalists. But that doesn't mean that everything that has been produced by these capitalists is somehow something that we should reject. I mean, that is not what the Marxist case for anything is, and certainly not pharmaceuticals, which we all need.
We want to take over the machine. We don't want to turn the machine off. I mean, the irony of all of this is, particularly with respect to vaccines, is they just aren't very profitable. About 30 years ago, the major pharmaceutical companies largely got out of the business of engaging in vaccine research and development, just as they largely got out of the business of any sort of research and development into new classes of antibiotic. The problem with vaccines and antibiotics with respect to the profit motive is the fact that once you take them, you have one course of them, and then you're done. You're only buying them once. So it is much more profitable for these companies to be producing drugs for chronic diseases, for which people have to take a drug sometimes every day, sometimes multiple times a day, every day for the rest of their lives. So this sort of conspiracist mindset around big pharma with respect to vaccines, that they're just out to make money, it's completely the opposite. Governments have had to, in the last few years, try to bribe pharmaceutical companies to engage in vaccine research and antibiotic research through a range of different things, like promising that other drugs, other candidate drugs, they'll sort of rush them through the regulatory process, which is a terrible idea, or sort of fixing markets to try to encourage them in some way. One of the main problems with all of that is that, okay, even if we do manage to incentivize them in some way to produce these, basically what we're doing there is we're leaving the cost of the unprofitable drugs for the public sector, the taxpayer. We have to pay for them, and leave the profitable drugs to be cherry-picked by the pharmaceutical companies. That's entirely unfair. What we should be doing is taking the pharmaceutical companies into the public sector, and then through the sale of the profitable drugs, we can cross-subsidize the ones that are unprofitable. It's a very similar model to the post office. Basically, it costs a lot more in terms of labor to take a parcel from New York to Anchorage, Alaska, but it doesn't cost you that much more than to send it to Chicago. And the reason is because everybody is an American citizen. Everybody has the equal right to equal access to communications. At least that was the idea behind a public postal system. We should adopt the postal model for pharmaceutical research as well.
Well, we love the post office, Jacobin. So, post office for X is always a model that we are willing to be supporting. We talked in your article. The sort of opening anecdote of the article is about Kamala Harris and the sort of dangers of some liberals adopting this kind of anti-vaxxer, some version of an anti-vaxxer, or something that plays into the hands of anti-vaxxers at least. But we haven't really spent a lot of time about talking about the right and about Trump. And someone is asking a very basic question that I should have asked you earlier. Matt Carson is saying that he recently read an article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists raising concerns about Trump rushing through a vaccine. And so should we be concerned about that? I think last month, the historian Rick Perlstein had a op-ed in the New York Times where he was talking about what happened when President Gerald Ford rushed out a vaccine for some kind of communicable disease that thankfully ended up being restricted to the military base that it was first found on. But he, ahead of an election, tried to rush out a vaccine really quickly, and the vaccine, when it was rushed out, was really not ready for prime time, and it ended up hurting a lot of people, which then turned those people, or people who heard about those cases, into anti-vaxxers, which is obviously an enormous danger. And that was just in the case of a disease that could have become a pandemic, but luckily was confined to this one military base. And so imagine if that were to happen when we've got a whole country and a whole world full of people who desperately want there to be a vaccine for this disease, and imagine millions, hundreds of millions, billions of people all of a sudden now becoming skeptical of vaccines because they saw that the rollout of it was botched because Trump wanted to get it out the door immediately.
Yeah, I mean, let me just be very, very clear that villain number one with respect to undermining confidence in vaccines at the moment in the United States and around the world, villain number one absolutely is Donald Trump, and villain number two is Vladimir Putin. It would be horrific if, as a result of these rush jobs, that there is some sort of significant problem with whatever the range of different things that potentially could happen there. That would be horrific in the middle of a pandemic. But that's why I said I'm not saying that I'm not putting Kamala Harris on the same level as that. What I'm saying is I just wish that she had said, that's why you shouldn't. Please don't meddle, so that there isn't this undermining of confidence. The second thing I would say with respect to that is that we have to recognize that vaccines are like anything else, any other endeavor that we do in society. Nothing is perfectly safe. There can't be anything that's perfectly safe. There will always be some issues somewhere. The question is, are the negative outcomes worse than the positive outcomes? Are they significantly worse? Or rather, sorry, are there significant negative outcomes, and are the positive outcomes, do they balance out significantly? I write in my article about how there was actually a bit of a bungle with the rollout of a dengue vaccine in the Philippines a few years ago, and this was really, really tragic. Not sure exactly why this happened, but basically, the fact of the matter is that dengue is an unusual disease in that your first bout with it is fairly straightforward, but if you get it a second time, it can be very, very, very harmful. And there's a sort of strange reaction within our immune systems that causes that. We still don't really quite understand. And there was a worry put out by some researchers at the time saying that if you give this dengue vaccine, to people who have not had dengue at least once, you might actually trigger that secondary, more extreme reaction to dengue. Now, because dengue is endemic in the Philippines, the number of people that would, even though that was a mistake, that there should be more rigorous in terms of making sure that everybody who gets the vaccine already has had dengue at least once. It's a very tiny number of people overall, because the vast majority of people do have some sort of exposure to dengue. So even though it was a mistake and 600 people died, which is terrible, thousands of people now are not taking not just that vaccine, but a range of other vaccines. So the outcome from the anti-vaccine sentiment is much worse in deaths and morbidity compared to how those 600 people who died. Now, I always have issues with sort of utilitarianism when it comes to human life, because there's some very obvious philosophical problems with it. Every human life every human has dignity, and so you want to avoid all possible chances of that balancing of, do we save more people over here by sacrificing these people here, or just not taking some, or basically trying to save the maximum, do the maximum good in the most of the time. Unfortunately, occasionally, that is what we have to do. We do have to balance these things out. And in this case, even when that happened, those 600 people died in the Philippines, the anti-vax reaction to that, or vaccine hesitancy reaction to that, is so much worse than that bungling of the rollout there. I guess just to finish off here, what it is, we have to really understand that nothing will ever be 100% safe. And we have to stop looking for perfectly safe things. What we have to do is look for the most safe things.
So we're almost out of time here. I have just two final questions for you. One is on the broader questions. I mean, not just about vaccinations, but about modern technology generally that comes from Forbidden Shuffler. How do you deal with the argument that the logic of capital is built in a lot of modern technology, which makes it very difficult to, quote, take over the machine in a socialist way?
Yeah. So this is the classical argument. But that's true of everything. Absolutely everything. Our democracy, our technology, our fashion sensibility, our the kind of music that we like, everything, absolutely everything is interwoven with class society, and not everything is interwoven with the profit motive. Over the decades, particularly within more social democratic countries, a lot of parts of production have been taken out of the market. So, for example, in Canada, where I live, we have public health care. I just got my flu shot. I rocked up with my my health card, and nurse gave it to me. No money change hands, no bureaucracy, no forms to fill in, nothing. Boom. So the reason I'm telling you this is that even though absolutely everything is class society implicates everything in class society, if your starting point is how can we trust X, Y, Z, in this case technology or science, because of class society, you're basically saying how can we trust anything, even your own sensibility, and then you're frozen. You can't do anything. We have to move from where we have to move from where we find ourselves, and we can slowly, in a stepwise fashion, move more and more of society and production out of commodity form, out of the profit motive. I think that waiting for a date on the calendar for a revolution to wash away everything I think that's unrealistic. I think we have to have a very, I guess now this is my own personal opinion, distinct from the article I wrote. I don't think that there's a distinction between social democracy and socialism. I think that it's a spectrum, and that we need to be thinking more and more about how this multi-generational struggle to build socialism is going to happen, rather than waiting for a French Revolution or Russian Revolution style date on a calendar. If we are stuck in the idea that we can't trust technology or science because of class society, that goes for everything. We'll never do anything. We'll never get anywhere. It's unrealistic and it's counterproductive.
Ooh, Leigh dropping the spicy comments right at the end there. We don't have time to dig into
Like,
that.
oh, I told you, he's a social democrat.
Well, that'll have to be a full talk for another day. But at the very least, whenever I hear, I mean, I think it's a good question the commenter has asked. But I mean, whenever I hear that question, I mean, of course, everything is tied up in this logic of capital and profit making that we as socialists and as Marxists don't agree with. But like, do you think that everything that the market produces is somehow not the commenter, I should be clear, but those who would make this argument for a sort of full break that, like, whatever. I mean, Justin Bieber is a product of the capitalist marketplace. I listened to the song Boyfriend earlier today, and it still bangs. It's a product of the marketplace, but that doesn't mean it still doesn't bang. It doesn't mean that it doesn't speak to some kind of human. The market's bad for many reasons, but the market also produces products that people want and find enjoyable.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
The point I was making is that class society implicates everything. That doesn't necessarily everything about class society is bad. Right. Similarly, outside of those sectors of our economy that we, in those countries where we've been able to do so, we've decommodified those sectors. Everything is imbricated with the profit motive. That doesn't mean that just because something is imbricated with the profit motive, it's bad. Justin Bieber is a great example of this. Yes.
Go listen to Boyfriend. It still bangs after all these years. Okay, so my last comment or question here is just that I think so many people, including people on the left, maybe even me before we had this conversation, did think of this question about anti-vaxxer nonsense as one that had to be, I don't know, just sort of defeated by the experts. But you're sort of, the experts who know that you need the vaccine, and they're going to strap you down to the chair and they're going to give it to you whether you like it or not. But like, you pointed out what's wrong with that approach to these things. And also, you pointed out that the anti-vaxxerism can flourish in this sort of like 21st century neoliberalized hellscape that we all exist in, and that we all know. Whether it's the loss of shared narratives, the loss certainly in the United States about any kind of sense of being a part of a collective project together, and breakdown of sense of basic social solidarities and all of that stuff. I mean, we know that on the left, we have a solution to that. I mean, we believe in we don't believe in that sort of like individualized, neoliberalized subject. We actually want to rebuild the sense of the collective. We want to rebuild that sense of social solidarity. And one key argument I'm going to take away from this conversation is that in being able to convince people to do things like take vaccines, which we all understand is absolutely crucial for public health, will require, it can't be accomplished on its own solely. It has to be part of that larger project of the rebuilding of social solidarity, of trust, of the rebuilding after all of the kind of individualization and atomization that we all know has been central to neoliberalism. Those things are not going to be done in separate spheres from each other. The one really depends on the other.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would say that I just as socialists don't leave anti-racism up to people of color to fight, and we don't leave fighting against homophobia up just to gays and lesbians. Similarly, science is something that we need to take on, defense of science, but also just as I think socialists have a much more interesting conversation about how class informs sexism and racism and homophobia. I think socialists can also have a much more interesting conversation about how class society and the profit motive undermine science. And you'd be surprised how many people within science are very aware of this. I get letters all the time from researchers who are saying, I got one yesterday, beautiful, really lovely article, email saying, I work in antibiotic resistance research, and I just read your article on vaccines, and I've read some of your other stuff around antibody resistance. And thank God somebody's finally saying this. We desperately need to take this out of the private sector. And the reason they're concerned about it is because they can see clearly how it's undermining their scientific research. So I think there's a huge role for us as socialists to be playing in the defense of science and allowing science to flourish in a way that the market just inhibits. I guess the last thing I would say is, I mean, vaccines are socialist, man. Like, the reason that you take them is not to save yourself, it's to save your fellow human being. What's more socialist than that? They're beautiful. Vaccines are this hint of the future society that we're building. Yeah.
Can't end it a better comment than that one. Thank you to Leigh Phillips again. Leigh is the author of a recent article in Jacobin. Well, he's also the author of 2 books. Oh, I'm making life difficult for Cale here. He's the author of this recent article in Jacobin, Tough on Anti-Vaxx Nonsense, Tough on the Causes of Anti-Vaxx Nonsense, which we've been discussing today. And he is also the author of 2 books, including People's Republic of Walmart, which I am reading this weekend, and it's part of the Jacobin series published through Verso Books. So,
yet, Micah?
I'm sorry. Maybe I shouldn't have admitted that on this call. I'm sorry. As a fellow author in the Jacobin Verso series, I should have read it as soon as it came out. I'm very sorry.
I haven't read all of them yet either.
Well, there are like 17 of them at this point because we are so productive. The Stackavinites, or however you pronounce that word here at Jacobin, we're just constantly cranking out content for you all to consume, and we appreciate you consuming it. Again, please like, share, and subscribe this video. Go buy Leigh's book, subscribe to Jacobin, and thanks for tuning in on your Friday night. And Leigh, thanks for taking the time with us.
No problem. It was great talking to Micah.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.